Nobody wanted the barn. That was the point of giving it to her. At 72, Ruth Calloway sat in a lawyer's office that smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner and listened to a stranger's voice divide up 34 years of her life, and when it was over, her husband's children had the house, the land, and the money. And Ruth had a falling-down stone barn and the acre of weeds it stood on. Gordon smirked when she signed for it. Diane looked at her phone. And Ruth, who had buried Walter Calloway 11 days before and had not yet cried where anyone could see her, folded her copy of the deed into her purse and thanked them, quietly, for the ride home. What none of them knew, not Gordon, not Diane, not the neighbors who shook their heads at the shame of it, not even Ruth herself. Walking down the lane that evening toward the gray hulk everyone in the township called junk, was that hanging in the high dark of that barn's rafters, wrapped and numbered and patient, was the finest thing anyone in that family had ever owned. Walter had spent 40 years putting it there. He had known exactly what his children would take, and exactly what they would sneer at, and he had built his wife's inheritance in the one place he could be certain none of them would ever look. This is the story of what Ruth Calloway found when she finally looked up. It had been a small funeral, the way March funerals in that corner of Pennsylvania tend to be. Walter Calloway was 79 when his heart stopped in the equipment bay of the barn he'd been born beside, and the church on the hill filled with the people a man gathers in a lifetime of fixing things, neighbors he'd pulled out of ditches, men he'd lent tools to and never asked after, women from the church who remembered his first wife and had, over 3 decades, mostly forgiven him the second one. Ruth sat in the front pew between his children because that was where the funeral director put her. Gordon, 54, wore the good suit he wore to closings. He sold farm equipment in 3 counties and had his father's shoulders and none of his quiet. Diane, 51, had flown in from Columbus and kept touching the pew rail as if checking it for dust. They were not cruel people, Ruth would have told you then. They were simply people who had decided, 34 years ago, that the seamstress their father married was a chapter that did not concern them, and they had never once revised the decision. At the luncheon afterward, in the church basement, Ruth overheard Diane tell a cousin that at least the estate was straightforward. She said it the way you'd say a storm had missed the house. The will was read on the second Tuesday of April in the office of Harold Voss, who had drawn up documents for Walter Calloway for 40 years, and who did not smile once that morning, though he looked at Ruth several times with an expression she was too tired to read. The farmhouse and its contents went to Gordon and Diane in equal shares. The 160 acres of leased cropland went to Gordon and Diane. The accounts, the certificates, the pickup, the tractor, and the tools of the shop went to Gordon and Diane. And then Voss cleared his throat and read the paragraph that made Gordon laugh out loud. One short syllable he didn't bother to swallow. To my wife, Ruth, the old bank barn at the foot of the lane, the ground beneath it, the granary house beside it, and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value, absolutely and without condition. That was all. No cash, no share of the land. A barn with half its slates loose, a 1-room granary house with a wood stove, and whatever rusted junk 40 years of farming had washed up inside them. Diane said, into the silence, that Daddy always did have a sense of humor. Voss looked down at his papers and said the language was exactly as Mr. Calloway had instructed it, and that he had declined to change a word of it, though it had been revised as recently as 5 years ago. Nobody asked what that meant. Ruth signed where the tabs pointed, and it was done in 40 minutes, 34 years, gone like a coat handed to the wrong person at a party. She could have fought it. The women at church told her so, in the gentle, insistent way of women who have watched too many widows fold. There were elective shares, spousal rights, a lawyer in Harrisburg who handled such things. Ruth listened and thanked them and did not call the lawyer in Harrisburg. Some of it was weariness. Some of it was pride. The specific pride of a woman who had entered that family with nothing and would not leave it holding out her hand. But underneath both, in a place she didn't examine, was something quieter. Walter had written that will himself, sound of mind, sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on. And in 34 years, Walter Calloway had never once done a careless thing to her. He was a man who checked the weather 3 days out before he'd promise a picnic. Whatever this was, and standing in the lane that April, looking at the barn's gray bulk against a cold sky, she could not for the life of her see what it was. It was not carelessness. She had 2 suitcases, a sewing machine, her needles and hoops and thread, $1,100 in a checking account, and a Social Security check. She had a granary house with a wood stove. It would have to be enough, because it was what he had left her, and she had decided, on no evidence at all, to trust him one more time. Gordon gave her until the 1st of May to be out of the farmhouse, and said she was welcome to take her personal things, pronouncing the word personal with a little edge, as if she might otherwise make off with the silverware his mother had picked out. Casey came the last day to help her move, Gordon's daughter, 27, the only one of them who had ever sat in Ruth's kitchen without being sent there. Casey carried the sewing machine down the lane on her hip like a baby and was angrier than Ruth allowed herself to be. Angry in the fluent, unembarrassed way of the young, saying it was disgusting, saying her father should be ashamed, saying Ruth should sue. Ruth told her to mind the step. The granary house was 1 room and a loft last lived in by a hired man sometime in the 60s, and the 2 of them scrubbed it end to end, aired the mattress, blacked the little stove, and tacked plastic over the north window against the wind. When they were done, Casey stood in the doorway looking down the yard at the barn and asked what on earth Ruth was going to do with that thing. Ruth looked at it a long moment. "Clean it," she said. "Finally, it's mine. I'd like to know what I own." She had come into that family in 1984 with a sewing machine and a hope she was too old, even then, to say out loud. Ruth Mercer, 38, renting a room over the pharmacy, taking in alterations and piecing quilts at night because her hands could not be still. Walter Calloway, 45, 5 years widowed, farming his father's ground with 2 half-grown children who had decided their mother's chair was to stay empty. He courted her the way he did everything, slowly, thoroughly, without one wasted word, and she had loved him for 34 years in the same grammar. The children never came around. Not with cruelty, mostly with weather. Diane addressed her Christmas cards to Dad and family. Gordon called her Ruth in a tone that measured exactly the distance between Ruth and Mom. And her quilts, the wedding rings and log cabins and yellow stars she sent into that family like ambassadors, years of evenings each, were received and thanked for and disappeared. She had stopped letting herself wonder where they went. A quilter learns early that you give the work away and close the door on it, or you go bitter, and Ruth had made her choice of the 2. What she did not know, all those years, sitting across holiday tables from people who looked through her, was that somebody at that table had been keeping the accounts. Walter never said. Walter, she would understand much later, was a man who believed that saying was cheap and keeping was gospel. The barn was a Pennsylvania bank barn, stone below and timber above, built into the slope of the hill so a wagon could roll straight onto the threshing floor from the high side. Walter's grandfather had raised it in 1904. The date was chiseled over the stone arch of the lower door. It had not sheltered an animal in 20 years. From the lane it looked exactly like what everyone said it was, gray board siding gone silver and split, ivy eating the north foundation, a roof whose slates had slid and shattered along one edge. Though only one edge, Ruth would think later. And how strange that she noticed it that first week without noticing that she'd noticed. The lower level was a catacomb of stanchions and cobwebs. The main floor was a cave of junk, a hay wagon with a broken tongue, drums of rusted bolts and fence wire. seed sacks gone to mouse nest, a workbench black with 60 years of oil, and hanging on the walls and from the beams overhead the whole tool vocabulary of a dead way of farming. Hay knives, breast chains, a block and tackle furred with dust, junk, Gordon had called it, and standing in the doorway that first morning with a broom in her hand and the light coming down in long, dusty blades through the gaps in the siding, Ruth could not honestly have argued with him. But it was quiet in there, and it smelled of old wood and old grain, of years, and it did not once look at her with pity, which was more than she could say for the church basement. She started sweeping in the corner nearest the door. She went at it the way she quilted, which was the way she did everything, one small square at a time, done properly, and never mind the size of the hole. Mornings, when her hands were best, she sorted and hauled. Afternoons, she swept and scrubbed and made her lists. A junk man from Route 30 took the fence wire and the drums and paid her $40 she was glad to have. The workbench cleaned up better than she expected. The wood under the oil was chestnut. She found swallows nesting in the eaves and left them alone. She found a 1950s calendar from a feed store in Oxford, a cigar box of buttons and harness rivets, a child's shoe gone hard as horn, the sediment of a family, hers by marriage and not by blood, and she handled all of it more gently than any of them would have guessed. In the evenings, her back ached in a way that felt, for the first time since March, like something earned rather than something suffered. The neighbors slowed their trucks in the lane to watch the widow sweep out her inheritance. Some of them waved. She learned later that at the diner in town, Gordon had told a booth full of men that the old girl was welcome to every splinter of it, and that the kindest thing anyone said in reply was nothing. By midsummer, the granary house had become, against every expectation including her own, a home. She caulked the seams and hung curtains made from a bolt of shirting she'd been saving 20 years for nothing in particular. She set the sewing machine under the south window where the light was longest and, for the first time since March, threaded it. The guild came out on a Tuesday with a casserole and inspection eyes. 14 women who had known her 40 years. And they walked the barn and the little house and said the things women say when they are deciding whether to pity you, and by the second pot of coffee they had decided against it. Because Ruth wasn't pitiful, she was busy, and there is no arguing with busy. In the evenings, she pieced a 9-patch out of the scrap basket just to hear the machine run, and sat afterward on the granary step while the light went off the barn's gray boards, and found she could not always hold on to the anger she was entitled to. The anger came, in the small hours sometimes, at the indignity of it, at Diane's little joke, at 34 years weighed out to 1 acre of weeds. But morning after morning the barn stood there in the wet grass, homely and patient. Hers, the first thing she had ever owned outright in her life, and by August she had caught herself, twice, calling it something other than junk. She had caught herself calling it the inheritance, without irony, and not entirely knowing why. The first strange thing was the roof. A man named Dietrich, who had slated barn roofs for 40 years and had a face like one, stopped his truck one morning in June to tell her that if she ever meant to sell the slate off that roof, he'd buy it, and while he was at it, he said the odd thing. Somebody'd been keeping that roof, he said. Not the whole of it. The west edge over the equipment bay was gone, no secret there, but the long east slope over the third bay, that was tight as a church. He'd replaced slates up there himself, he said, twice, the last time maybe 5 years back, and Walter had paid cash and asked him not to make a job of talking about it, and Dietrich, being Dietrich, hadn't. Until now, when it didn't seem to matter anymore. Ruth stood in the yard after his truck rattled off, shading her eyes, looking up at the long east slope of that worthless roof, tight as a church over the third bay, and felt something turn over slowly in her chest, like the first stitch going into a marked line. Walter had spent money on this barn, quietly, 5 years ago, the same season, she realized, doing the arithmetic without wanting to, that he had revised his will. The second strange thing was the coffee can. She found it in July, in the old tack room off the threshing floor, on a shelf behind a row of paint cans whose labels had faded to weather maps, a red coffee tin, and inside it, wrapped in a clean rag that had been folded, not stuffed, a brass key on a loop of waxed string, and nothing else. It was not a door key. It was small and old-fashioned, the kind of key that belongs to a cabinet or a chest, and the rag it was wrapped in was a piece of muslin, washed soft, the sort of cloth Ruth had used all her life to wrap finished quilts against dust, and the sight of it there in her palm, in the tack room light, raised the hair on her arms before her mind had assembled a single reason why. Walter did not fold rags. Walter's rags lived in a bushel basket by the shop door and were used until they dissolved. Somebody had wrapped this key the way you wrap a thing you mean to be found by a particular kind of person, the kind who would notice that the cloth was washed muslin and that the fold was a quilter's fold, edges in, soft side out. She stood there holding it for a long time. Then she went looking for the lock it fit. It took her 4 days. She tried the shop cabinets, the desk in the granary house, a padlocked toolbox that turned out to hold taps and dies. And then, on a Sunday evening, in the grain room at the north end of the main floor, a narrow, bin-lined chamber she had been leaving for last because the light in there was poor. She moved a stack of feed sacks and found, built into the wall between 2 grain bins where no cabinet had any business being, a seed cabinet of oiled chestnut with a hasp and a small brass lock, and the key turned in it like a held breath being let out. Inside there was no seed. There was a package wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine, square-cornered and heavy as a Bible. There were cedar blocks, a dozen of them, still sharp-smelling. There was a roll of washed muslin and a pair of white cotton gloves, folded, a man's size. And there was a note, 1 line, in the small, careful handwriting she had read on 40 years of seed orders and Christmas tags, unsigned because it did not need signing. It said, "Put the gloves on first, Ruthie." She sat down on the feed sacks. It was a while before she untied the twine. The package was a ledger, a plain gray cloth-bound account book, the kind sold in every stationery store in the country in 1980, its corners worn round and its spine gone soft with handling. And when she opened it on her knees in the grain room's failing light, she did not at first understand what she was reading, because it looked like bookkeeping, and Walter kept books on everything. Columns, dates, sums. The first entry was dated October of 1984, and it read, Number 1. Lone Star, cotton, hand-pieced, hand-quilted. Maker, R. Mercer, Harvest Auction, Grace Methodist. $11, worth more than the lot of them knew. Third bay, above the collar beams. Ruth read it twice. R. Mercer, Ruth Mercer. Her own name, the name she'd carried up to the age of 38, and the quilt was her quilt. The Lone Star she had pieced through the winter her mother died and given to the church sale because the ladies asked, and because she was new in town and wanted to be agreeable, and it had gone for $11 to some farmer at the back of the room whose face she hadn't seen. 3 weeks before a tall, quiet widower first spoke to her at the feed store about, of all things, thread, he had never told her. 34 years of marriage, and he had never once told her that he was the farmer at the back of the room, that he had bought her quilt before he had ever said a word to her. She held the ledger against her chest in the dark of the grain room and cried the way she had not cried at the funeral, and the swallows moved in the eaves, and that was only the first entry. There were 40 more. She read the rest of it that night at the granary house table, by lamplight with the stove ticking, and it was like listening to a man confess to a lifetime of a sin no one had ever named, entry after entry, year over year, in the same small, careful hand. Number 4. Album quilt, signed and inked, Chester County, dated 1834. 63 names. Estate of E. Rudge, sold off the porch in boxes. $40. They were using its box for a doorstop. Number 9. Whole cloth, indigo, wool, likely 1810 or older. Rag pile, Kirk salvage, $3. It took me an hour to breathe right. Number 13. Baltimore album, Applic, dated 1848, red and green, eagle and flower baskets. Auction near Nottingham, listed as old bedding, $210. The most I ever paid, and I'd have gone to 1,000. Tell no one. Number 22. Sanitary Fair quilt, 1864. Embroidered names of a whole congregation. Some of the boys' names with black borders. Nobody at that sale knew what they were laughing at. $12. On and on. 40 years of it. Estate sales and rag piles and farm auctions across 3 counties. Quilts bought for the price of lunch because the world had decided the women who made them were nobody. And every entry ended the same way. The same 5 words, like a bearing repeated by a man walking in the dark, 3rd bay above the collar beams. And scattered among the numbered entries, rarer were the other lines, the ones that were not bookkeeping at all. Under number 9, the indigo whole cloth, a year of some woman's evenings in this. No name on it anywhere. That's the crime. Under number 17, R. Asked tonight why I smelled of mothballs. Told her the shop. First lie in 9 years, and it was for her. Under number 26, dated the year Walter turned 70. Dietrich done with the east slope. Cash. The dry side of the barn is now the driest room in the county, and not one soul will ever think to wonder why. Ruth sat with her thumb on that line a long while. She thought of all the years of small absences. The Saturday auctions, he said, were 4 tractor parts, and came home from with tractor parts too. Because he was thorough. The smell of cedar in his coat. The way he would stand in the door of her sewing room some evenings and watch her work with an expression she had put down to a man, remembering to be grateful. He had not been remembering to be grateful. He had been keeping a ledger. The last numbered entry was dated in November, 4 months before he died, and it was number 41. And unlike all the others, it listed no price and no place. It said only, number 41. Lone Star, Cotton, Maker, R. Mercer, home where it started. And under that, alone at the bottom of the page, it's the barn, Ruthie, it was always the barn. Look up. She did not sleep. At first light she crossed the wet grass with a flashlight she didn't need, and stood on the threshing floor in the gray dawn, and looked up into the 3rd bay, and looked at what she had been looking at for 3 months. High overhead, where the collar beams tied the rafters together under the tight east slope, boards had been laid across the beams to make a narrow platform, the way farmers do. And on that platform, and slung beneath it on iron hooks, were the long gray-green bundles she had catalogued in her mind the first week as old sacking. Rolled tarps, insulation bats, junk too awkward to be worth the ladder. Junk in the junk barn. It was the best camouflage in the world, because it was true from the floor and a lie from the beams. She counted them with the flashlight, her mouth moving like a woman saying a rosary. Along the platform, hung from the underside, laid across the ties, 30. Then, deeper against the roof where the shadow was thickest, more, 40, 41. The ladder to the loft was fixed to the mow wall, and Walter had renailed every rung of it. She could see the bright heads of the new nails from the floor. And at 72 years old, alone in an empty barn at 6 a.m, Ruth Calloway put her hand on that ladder and climbed. The platform was swept. That was the first thing. 60 feet of dusty chaos below, and up under the ridge a clean plank walk, cedar blocks nailed along at every arm's length, and the bundles in their rows, each one wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting lapped and taped like a man wraps against decades. and under the plastic, when she peeled the tape of the nearest one with shaking fingers, washed muslin, and inside the muslin, tissue, and inside the tissue, cloth, she had meant to be methodical. She was a methodical woman. But the first quilt came out of its wrappings into the light of the east window like something surfacing, reds and greens still saturated, the applique fine as penwork, baskets and wreaths and an eagle with spread wings, and in one corner, in fading ink, a date, 1848. Number 13, the Baltimore album. She knew enough, 40 years of guild meetings and library books, she knew exactly enough to know what she was holding and that she should not be holding it in her bare hands, and she laughed at herself through her running nose. Because the gloves, of course. Put the gloves on first. Ruthie. He had known she wouldn't. He had known her to the stitch. She sat down on the clean planks of the platform in her dead husband's secret room, under the roof he had kept sound around it in a barn he had let the world call worthless, with 170-year-old masterpiece in her lap, and let the fact of it arrive at last and all at once. None of this was an accident. Not the barn, not the will, not the smirk on Gordon's face that Walter had surely foreseen down to the muscle. Her husband had left his children everything they could see, and left her everything they couldn't. It took her 9 days to bring them all down, working alone at first, and then, when her arms gave out, with a block and tackle Walter had left rigged at the loft edge, oiled, she noticed, the only oiled thing in the barn. She set up in the grain room, the driest chamber under the tight slope, laid clean sheets over a trestle table, and unwrapped them one by one against the ledger, checking each number, and the ledger was never wrong. The signed album, quilt from 1834, its 63 inked names still legible. A whole congregation of dead women introducing themselves across 2 centuries. The indigo whole cloth, older than the barn, older than the county road, a midnight blue field stitched in feathers and ferns you could only see when the light came sideways. A year of some nameless woman's evenings. The sanitary fair quilt, with its embroidered rolls of names, some bordered in black thread, which she could not handle without stopping. Amish bars and sunshine and shadow pieces in colors like church glass. A crazy quilt from 1885, silk and velvet, a spider web embroidered in one corner for luck. And the last 7 entries in the ledger, numbers 35 through 41, were not rare and not old and not, to any appraiser on earth, valuable at all. Number 35, double wedding ring. Maker, Ruth Calloway. Given to D. For her wedding. Found at a consignment shop in Columbus, price tag still on it. $15. She never even washed it. Number 38, baby quilt, yellow stars. Maker, Ruth Calloway. Yard sale, Gordon's neighborhood. $1. $1. Her quilts, the ones she had pieced for his children and his grandchildren over 30 years, given away with both hands, sold, drifted, dumped, and Walter had gone out and found them, one by one, over years, and bought her love back at yard sale prices, and hung it in the rafters with the museum pieces, because in his ledger they belonged in the same column. In the evenings of those 9 days she did the other arithmetic, the kind Walter would have respected. She went through the ledger with a pencil and a scrap of paper and totaled the price column, 40 years of it. Every estate sale and rag pile and auction from 1984 to the end. And the whole of it, the Baltimore album, the signed names, the indigo, all 41, came to a little under $4,000. $4,000 spent a few bills at a time across 4 decades by a man whose son sold $250,000 combines and had gone through his father's accounts after the funeral like a man panning a creek, and found nothing missing, because nothing ever was missing. It had all been accounted for, in a gray book, in a seed cabinet, under the word pieces. She thought about the marriage that had been happening alongside the marriage she knew about. The Saturdays, the careful cash, the one lie in 9 years. And it was for her. Other women, she knew, learned after the funeral about the other kinds of ledgers men kept, the accounts, the bottles, the names. She sat in the granary house with the lamp on and understood that she had somehow, at 72, become the only widow she had ever heard of who found out her husband's secret life and discovered it was her. It did not make the grief smaller. It made it enormous, and it made it warm, and some nights that was harder, and she let it be hard, and kept reading. The letter was in bundle number 41, folded into the Lone Star, in an envelope, with one word on it. It was dated in November, the same week as the last entry, and it was not long. Walter was not long, on paper or off it. She read it at the trestle table with the gloves on, which would have made him laugh. Ruthie. It began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the will's been read, and I expect Gordon smirked, and I expect you signed anyway, because you always did trust me further than I deserved. So let me say it plainly and once. They will take the house, and I'm sorry for that. But the house was never where I kept you. He told her the rest in half a page, how he'd bought the Lone Star 3 weeks before he met her, and hunted its maker's name through the church ladies like a detective, how the collecting had started as a way of being near what she was and became, over 40 years, the only sermon he knew how to write, that the world threw away women's work because it didn't know how to read it, and that he, Walter Calloway, who could not thread a needle, had decided to spend his tractor part money learning to read. The children are provided for, and they'd have contested anything I left you that looked like money, the letter said. They will never contest a barn. Voss has the wording watertight, the barn and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value. That's you, Ruthie. That's 40 years of you. Sell them. Keep them. Hang them in a museum with the makers' names in big letters. The ledger tells you what's what and who was who. Every one of them reminded me of you. That was the whole of my system. It was signed the way he signed the Christmas tags. No love, no name. Just the initial, W, and one line beneath it, cramped at the bottom edge of the page as if he'd nearly run out of room for the thing he'd waited a lifetime to say. You were never the second chapter. You were the book. For 11 days she told no one. It was not strategy. Whatever the family later claimed, it was something more like the silence after music. She went about her mornings, coffee, the swallows, the walk down the wet grass, and every afternoon she sat in the grain room with the ledger, and one quilt at a time, reading the names. Hannah Rudge, 62 other inked signatures out of Chester County, 1834. The unsigned indigo woman whom Ruth had privately begun to call Evening, because that was what she had sewn with, a year of evenings. It occurred to Ruth, somewhere in that stretch of days, that she was the only living person on earth who knew these women had existed, that the knowledge was a flame cupped in exactly 2 hands, hers and a dead man's, and that whatever she did next, she must not do it carelessly. It also occurred to her, more slowly, because she was out of the habit of thinking this way, that she was probably not poor anymore. The thought did not land the way poverty had. She made a pot roast. She wrote, in her own hand, on the first blank line of the ledger, she had decided Walter would want the ledger kept, not enshrined, the date, and one line, all 41 down safe. Gloves on, mostly, and on the 12th day, she called the only member of Walter Calloway's family who had ever carried her sewing machine like a baby, and said, "Casey, I need you to come out here, and bring that good camera of yours, and don't tell your father." Casey stood in the grain room for a long time without saying anything, which for Casey was a medical event. She walked the trestle table end to end twice, hands behind her back like a visitor at a gallery, and when she finally spoke it was to ask, in a small voice, whether that date said what she thought it said. Then Ruth gave her the ledger and watched the girl meet her grandfather, the real one. The one none of them had known was in the house with them all those years, page by page. Watched her get to number 38, the $1 baby quilt, and put her hand over her mouth, because number 38 was hers. The yellow stars. It had hung on the wall of her nursery, and then it had gone wherever things went in Gordon's house, and her grandfather had followed it to a yard sale 3 streets over and paid $1 and written down the date. Casey cried the way her generation cried, laughing at herself with her eyes streaming, and then she blew her nose and became extremely 27. This needed documentation. This needed climate control. This needed an expert yesterday. And did Ruth have any idea at all, what signed and dated early American quilts went for? Because Casey had a phone and was not afraid to use it. Ruth said she had some idea. Ruth had been a guild member for 40 years, but she let the girl talk, because the sound of one single member of that family being glad for her was a thing she had not heard in so long that she wanted to stand in it a while. The way you stand in the first warm rain. They photographed all 41 over a weekend, quilt by quilt, ledger page by ledger page, and Casey wrote the email, Ruth dictating the facts, Casey supplying the adjectives, and sent it to the textile department of a museum in Philadelphia whose name Ruth had only ever seen on the spines of library books. The reply came in 4 hours, on a Sunday, which Casey said meant everything. A curator named Dr. Elaine Prather wrote that the photographs were either very good fakes or the most significant private discovery of American quilts she had seen in her career. And either way, she would like to drive out on Thursday. And might she bring a conservator? She arrived in a small car with a large assistant and cotton gloves of her own, a brisk gray bobbed woman somewhere past 60 who shook Ruth's hand and looked at the barn the way Ruth had learned to look at it. Up. What happened at the trestle table over the next 6 hours had the rhythm of a church service. Long silences, sudden low exclamations, the assistant taking photographs of photographs. At the Baltimore album quilt, Dr. Prather stopped talking entirely for 4 minutes by the grain room clock. At the 1834 album quilt, she took out a magnifier and read the inked names one by one, lips moving, and then said, half to herself, that there were graduate students who would weep over this quilt, and that she might join them. At the indigo whole cloth, she laid her gloved palm an inch above the surface, tracing feathers in the air, and asked where in God's name it had been found. Ruth said, a rag pile at a salvage yard, $3, and Dr. Prather closed her eyes briefly, like a woman hearing about a near miss on a highway. But it was the ledger that undid her. Ruth had saved it for last, half from shyness. It was, after all, a family document, a love letter 40 years long, and when Dr. Prather understood what she was holding, she sat down on a feed sack without checking it for dust. Provenance, she explained to Casey, who was filming everything, was the whole game and the missing half of the field. America was full of orphaned quilts, gorgeous and mute, their makers erased. What was vanishingly rare was not the cloth, but the record, and here was a collection where every single piece came with a date, a place, a price, a maker's name where one existed on this earth, and a chain of custody in one careful hand. Collectors pay for cloth, she said. Historians build careers on paper. This is both, and I have never seen both. As to money, she was a curator, not an auction house, but she would not insult them by being coy, conservatively. At auction, the collection was worth several $100,000. The Baltimore album alone could bring between $150,000 and $250,000 on the right afternoon, with the right 2 bidders in the room. The signed album quilt and the indigo would start bidding wars of their own. The rest, she gestured down the table, at church glass and spider webs and sunshine and shadow, was a museum exhibition, entire as it stood, and she was prepared to say so in writing. Then she came to the last 7 bundles, the consignment shop wedding ring and the $1 yellow stars, checked them against their ledger pages, and looked up at Ruth with an expression that had nothing professional left in it at all. "And these," she said. Ruth said those weren't valuable. "Doctor." Prather looked back down at the page where a dead man had written she never even washed it, and said, quietly, that she begged to differ, and that with Ruth's permission the exhibition would end with them. Before she left that evening, Dr. Prather stood a while in the barn doors, looking up into the third bay, at the empty platform and the hooks, and asked the question Ruth had been waiting all day for somebody to ask. What did Ruth want? Not what would she take. What did she want? Casey, who had been advocating loudly for an auction house in New York since roughly noon, went quiet, because it was a real question, and she knew her grandmother by choice well enough to know the answer wasn't simple. Ruth looked down the trestle table at 41 squares of other women's evenings and said she wanted 3 things, and named them in order. She wanted the quilts safe, properly stored, insured, someplace where a leaking pipe or a careless match couldn't undo 40 years and 200. She wanted the names read, Hannah Rudge and her 62 sisters, the black-bordered boys. Every maker the ledger could put a name to, in big letters, the way the letter said. And she wanted enough, only enough, to keep the barn standing and the taxes paid, and to never again have to be grateful for a ride home from a lawyer's office. The money beyond that, she said, was Walter's joke, and she intended to laugh at it slowly, over years, in no hurry at all. Dr. Prather nodded the way people nod when a thing is settled right, and said the museum could work with all 3, and that in her experience the collectors could smell it when a seller wasn't hungry, and paid better for the insult. The story got out the way stories do in a small township, a conservator's van, twice, a slate man with a long memory and a booth at the diner, a guild lady sworn to secrecy, and then her sister. By late October, it had reached the county paper, which sent a young reporter who wrote it up honestly and could not resist the headline, "Widow finds fortune in rafters of junk barn," and the county paper was on the internet, and the internet reached Columbus, and it reached the equipment dealership, and on the first Sunday in November, Gordon's truck came down the lane for the first time since the funeral. Ruth watched it come from the granary house window and put the coffee on, because some habits are load-bearing. Gordon was expansive at first, hat literally in his hands, full of how about that, and Dad always was deep, and Ruth let him get all the way to the end of it, to the part he had driven 90 minutes to say, which was that, of course, legally speaking, the quilts were a bit of a gray area. Weren't they? Dad's personal property, really, when you thought about it, part of the estate proper, and the family would naturally want to handle it fairly, all of it in the tone of a man doing her a kindness. Ruth poured his coffee, and said the will said the barn and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value. Gordon smiled the closing smile and said wills could be read a lot of ways. Ruth said, "Then I expect we'll have it read the one more time," and thanked him for coming, and stood in the doorway while he turned the truck around, and noticed that her hands were not shaking, and thought, he doesn't know about the letter. Walter, you even foresaw the coffee. The petition arrived before Thanksgiving. Gordon and Diane, through an estates firm in Lancaster, asked the probate court to construe the will, to rule that contents meant farm equipment and fixtures, as any testator would naturally intend of a barn, and could not have been meant to pass a 6-figure collection of fine antiques. In the alternative, they raised the possibility, delicately, monstrously, that the quilts had been placed in the barn after the will was signed, or even after Walter's death. That last sentence did what nothing since the funeral had done. It made Ruth Calloway angry. Casey offered to testify against her own father before anyone asked her to. "Doctor, Prother wrote an affidavit on museum letterhead dating the plastic sheeting, the muslin, the cedar, the nail heads in the ladder, the decades of it. And Harold Voss, who had waited 40 years to be interesting, telephoned Ruth on a Tuesday evening and told her that Walter had left instructions for exactly this weather, a sealed copy of the letter in the office safe, and Voss's own file memorandum, dated 5 years back, in which Walter Calloway had directed the phrase of whatever kind and value into the will, and, when Voss remarked it was unusual language for a barn, had answered. Voss read it aloud over the phone, deadpan from the memo, that the barn holds the only things I own worth fighting over. And the wording had better hold, because my son will read the will like a man checking a receipt. Ruth laughed until she had to sit down on the stairs. It was the first time she had laughed at something Walter said since March, and it would not, the way things were headed, be the last. The winter between the petition and the hearing was long, and Ruth spent it the way she had spent every winter of her life, piecing. She set a frame up in the granary house and worked through January on a sampler, and while her needle went in and out, the township made up its mind, booth by booth, pew by pew. The diner, which in May had let Gordon's every splinter joke pass without comment, developed a memory. Dietrich told the roof story to anyone who sat down. The junk man told the $40 story. The guild told no stories at all, which in a small township is the loudest position available. Diane telephoned once, in February, a long call that started with concern for how Ruth was managing out there alone, in the cold, and worked its way, gradually, in Diane's bright administrative voice, around to how families shouldn't let things like this get to courtrooms. How there was surely a number that made sense to everyone. Ruth listened to the whole of it, sitting on the stairs with the receiver, watching the snow come down past the window onto the barn's tight east slope. Then, she said that she agreed completely that it should never have gotten to a courtroom, and let the silence do its work, and wished Diane a good night. She was not proud of how much she enjoyed that. She confessed it to the sampler, stitch by stitch, and the sampler absorbed it, the way the work had absorbed everything else for 60 years, and the snow kept falling, and the barn kept standing, and March came. The hearing was set for a gray morning in March of 2019, a year almost to the day since the funeral, in a courtroom on the second floor of the county courthouse, with radiators that knocked like knuckles. Ruth wore the navy dress she had worn to be married in a different lifetime, because it still fit, and because she was done apologizing for sentiment. She had expected to sit alone at her table with her lawyer, a calm young woman Voss had recommended, and she did not sit alone in any way that mattered. The gallery behind her filled, row by row, with the quilt guild, 14 strong silver heads in a line like a border print, with Dietrich the slate man in a necktie the color of roofing felt, with 2 church ladies who had known Walter's mother, with Casey, who sat on Ruth's side of the aisle in full view of her father and never once looked away from the front. Gordon and Diane sat with their Lancaster lawyers and did not turn around. Ruth understood, looking at their backs, that whatever the judge decided, something had already been decided in that room, in the seating, the way it is decided in churches and diners and townships, and it had not been decided in their favor. The morning went the way Voss had predicted, because the men who write things down at the time always beat the men who remember things later. The Lancaster lawyers argued that no reasonable farmer means heirloom textiles when he says the contents of a barn, that the language was boilerplate, that equity abhorred a windfall. Then, Voss took the stand, 78 years old, 40 years of Walter Calloway's paper in a banker's box, and read his own memorandum into the record, the phrase requested by the client, of whatever kind and value, the client's stated reason, the barn holds the only things I own worth fighting over, the date, 5 years before Walter's death. The same season the east slope of the barn roof was quietly reslated, which Dietrich called for 10 minutes, confirmed with visible satisfaction and one small editorial, tightest slope I ever laid. And now I guess we know for who. Doctor. Prother testified to the age of the wrappings and the decades of cedar dust in the platform boards, and dismantled the suggestion that anyone had staged the collection after the fact with the weary precision of a woman grading a poor paper. And then Ruth's lawyer read the letter. She read it slowly, into a courtroom that had gone so quiet the radiators sounded rude. They will take the house, and I'm sorry for that, but the house was never where I kept you. And Ruth watched the court reporter's hands, because she could not watch anything else, and when the reading reached the last line, the one about the book, one of the guild ladies behind her made a small, broken sound, and the judge did not gavel it. And Diane, at the far table, put her face in her hands, and Ruth was surprised to find that she took no pleasure in it. Almost none. She was a truthful woman, even about herself. The judge ruled from the bench, which the young lawyer whispered was rare. He said the will's language was not ambiguous, and that even if it were, the extrinsic evidence, the memorandum, the roof, the wrappings, the ledger, and the decedent's letter established the testator's intent beyond any honest question. Walter Calloway had known precisely what was in his barn, had chosen his words precisely to convey it, and had trusted the court to read plain English plainly. A trust the court saw no reason to disappoint. The petition was denied. Costs to the petitioners. He was silent a moment, and then, in the tone judges use when they permit themselves one human sentence, he said that in 30 years on the bench he had construed a great many wills, and that this was the first one he'd ever seen that was also, so far as he could tell, a love letter with a legal description, and he congratulated the widow on her marriage. The gallery did not cheer, because the guild does not cheer, but 14 silver heads turned toward Ruth at once, which amounted to the same thing. In the corridor afterward, Gordon came at her sideways through the crowd, and his face was doing something complicated, and what came out of it, at last, was that he didn't know his father had it in him. Ruth looked at her husband's son for a long moment, and found she had no wish left to wound him, which was its own kind of verdict. He had it in him the whole time, she said. You just never checked the barn. And she shook his hand, because Walter would have wanted it, and went down the courthouse steps into the March light with the guild around her like an honor guard. The exhibition opened in Philadelphia the following October, in 3 rooms with the light kept low and kind. Dr. Prather had fought her own board over the title and won, so the banner over the door said what the ledger was. The Widow's Ledger, 40 years of rescued American quilts. The ledger itself sat first, open under glass, to the page for number 1, the $11 Lone Star, and the wall text told the story straight, because no curator alive could improve on it. The great quilts hung in the first 2 rooms with their makers' names in big letters. Exactly as the letter had ordered, Hannah Rudge and her 62 sisters, the Sanitary Fair congregation with its black-bordered boys, maker unknown for evening, though the card beneath the indigo carried, at Ruth's request, one added line, a year of some woman's evenings. Scholars came, and school buses, and quilters by the guildload from 4 states. And the last room, the small one, held 7 ordinary quilts of no monetary value whatsoever, a double wedding ring with a consignment tag preserved under glass beside it, a yellow star baby quilt with its ledger page enlarged on the wall, $1, and the museum's own attendance ledger showed what Dr. Prather had predicted. People walked briskly enough past $200,000 of Baltimore applique, and stood the longest, and were quietest, in the room that cost $8 total. Ruth sold nothing that first year but 1 quilt, an unsigned utility piece with no name to protect, and the check reslated the west slope of the barn, which Dietrich did at cost, for the story. The rest she loaned, on the condition the name stayed big. She was not rich the way the county paper had promised. She was something the paper had no column for. She stayed in the granary house. Gordon's lawyers in the spring sent a stiff-kind letter offering to sell her the farmhouse at appraisal, and she declined by return post, politely, with real gratitude. Because the offer meant Casey was working on him, but the truth was the house had never been where Walter kept her either, and she knew now where she lived. She kept the barn. The guild met there on second Tuesdays, from May to September. Frames set up on the swept threshing floor under the third bay, 14 needles going in the long gold light, while the swallows came and went, and new quilts grew by inches directly beneath the beams where the old ones had waited out their 40 years of dark. And on a winter evening at the granary house table, with the stove ticking and the Lone Star across her knees, she used it. Walter's ledger was very clear about what things were for. Ruth put on her reading glasses, opened the gray book to the first blank line, and wrote in her own steady hand number 42. Sampler, cotton, begun this January. Maker, Ruth Calloway, age 73. For Casey's wedding. Not for sale. Not now. Not ever. And this time everyone knows what it's worth. She looked at the page a while. Then she added the last line, the one the whole book had been waiting on, and closed the cover on it. Entry made at the barn. Home, where it started. Thank you for staying to the end of Ruth's story. Stories like this one only work when someone stays for the whole quiet length of them, the way Walter stayed, and the way you just did. Now it's your turn to add a line to the ledger. Somewhere in your life there was a person like him, someone whose love did its work in silence. In a garage, or a garden, or a savings book, or a barn. Someone you maybe didn't fully read until the years let the light come sideways. Tell us about them in the comments. Tell us their name, and the quiet thing they did. Because names written down are names kept. And this channel is, in the end, a ledger too. And we read every entry. If this story earned it, share it with one person who needs reminding that being overlooked is not the same as being unloved. And if you'd like more stories of women they wrote off opening the one door nobody checked, subscribe to the Widow's Ledger and tap the bell so the next one finds you. Until then, look after the quiet ones. And every so often, look up.